From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
A cultural clash on KU's campus after the discovery of several Native American bodies stored there illegally. Now, demands for answers. Plus, the fight to find homes for those in need of a helping hand as fewer landlords offer aid. But first, the self-titled education governor versus the man who wants to replace her on education. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. We've got just about two and a half weeks left now until Election Day. Some of us are looking forward to it. Early voting is already underway, and the candidates are going all out to get you to the polls in their favor. That includes the two leading gubernatorial candidates, each with their own idea on what Kansas should do about education for the next 4 years. You can see the governor's history as an administrator in her plan to streamline pre-K education. She wants to form a new cabinet-level department to handle all such programs across the state and create a secretary of early childhood education. She also wants to work to make Kansas more family-friendly by making childcare more available and more affordable for parents. Her plan is full of specific details.
Clearly, Laura Kelly has branded education. That's the issue. She wants to take her into a second term.
In addition to outlining more options for pre-K programs and fully funding special education, Kelly has talked about more workforce training for students who aren't college-bound.
She really wants to brand herself as the education governor.
While Derek Schmidt has talked about supporting school choice and a parent's Bill of Rights. The most detailed part of his plan, though, looks at school security.
Emphasizing hiring more school resource officers, which are basically police officers in schools. More early warning systems if there's a potential threat to a school.
Political analysts say perhaps reflecting his own knowledge base.
Derek Schmidt is a 3-term attorney general, and that is a law enforcement position.
And playing to his base among Republicans by rejecting anything resembling critical race theory. But there's one place where the two candidates overlap on education.
He also has discussed more resources for student mental health. And that's also a part of Governor Kelly's plan, so they overlap at that point.
And joining us this week to discuss this and other topics, we have Diane Leffler with the Wichita Eagle and Carlos Noya Correger, a immigration attorney and former congressional candidate from the Wichita area, joining me on the desk. And here by Zoom, we've got Dr. Beth Vanami, a political analyst from UMKC. Thank you all so much. And Beth, since we've got you up, I'm going to start with you. As we look at this, you know, it's not a surprise to see education coming from Laura Kelly. But as we look at these two plans side by side, they seem very similar in a lot of ways and even do have that one point of overlap.
Yeah, I would say they're actually pretty different in the sense that I think Kelly is really tapping into something that matters to a lot of Kansans, which is this childcare costs and the increasingly limited options available to parents. And I think that's a good strategy. But at the same time, I think Schmidt's focus on critical race theory, on safety in schools, on the pandemic closures, speaks to his base and speaks to concerns that they have. So I think both are taking education as an important concern to most Kansans and just adding their twist to it.
Yeah. Hey, Diane, does either of these positions seem to have an edge with voters one way or the other from what you're hearing?
Well, I think that I mean, everybody loves schools, right? And but which schools do you love? And that's going to be the question here, because with a Derek Schmidt administration, it would be far more friendly to the private schools, and a Kelly administration is going to be far more supportive of the public school system. So that, you know, I would expect that with the veto-proof majority, that, you know, we will see a push in the next, and I mean, let's face it, they'll still have a veto-proof majority after this election. But, you know, we will see a push for more voucher-type programs. And they can't actually do exactly what they want to do because there's a constitutional prohibition on giving money to religious schools. So they have to kind of launder it around. But I think we will see much more of that, especially if there's a Schmidt win in this race.
Well, and as we look at this issue, of course, we know education always a big deal with Kansas voters. And Carlos, you've got firsthand experience of that, having run a couple of campaigns yourself. How important is education, do you think, as we're coming into these last weeks of the race?
All right, the two most important things to get ahead as a society, we need to invest in infrastructure as well as education. Education creates a future. We need to invest in every single child, and that's why public education is so important, especially special education, because those are vulnerable children, but we could go ahead and give them the opportunity to become self-sufficient, empower them. They get to invest into our community. We get to change their whole world, even if we can't change a whole world completely. So I think that the priority should always be a quality public education equally for all.
And that for all, a part of the governor's plan that she unveiled this week. Beth, a special education, fully funding that, a big issue for the governor, and also now for a lot of schools who say they've been falling behind on special education funding over the last 10 years or so because the state has not been keeping up with inflation, basically.
Right. I think school districts are thrilled by this idea of having a sort of a fully funded special education program that doesn't eat into their general education funding. And I think that's, for schools, they don't want to have to choose. And that's what's happening over the last few years, for sure.
Yeah. Well, on another topic, you may have seen recent campaign ads supporting Attorney General Derek Schmidt and his record on fighting crime. Several feature law enforcement organizations. One features an individual who's endorsed Schmidt's campaign for governor. And that one in particular, you have a question about. I've gotten several calls and emails about this ad with the Barton County Sheriff endorsing Derek Schmidt's campaign for governor. Several of you have asked if it's illegal or at least unethical for a sheriff to publicly endorse a political campaign like this. The short answer is no. Our political analysts tell us the Hatch Act is the law that may cover this. It makes it illegal for some local, state, and federal employees to engage in certain political activities. However, it does not mention endorsements. Plus, the fact Kansas sheriffs are elected and not appointed or hired directly by the county puts them in a different category.
They too are engaged in elections. They too are running a campaign. So, it makes it at least a little bit more understandable that they're speaking the same language in terms of campaign politics. It is very common for elected officials to go ahead and endorse other elected officials down the ballot.
And Diane, I know I've gotten calls about a lot of different ads. I'm sure you have too, but this one seemed to take the cake for sheer numbers, even though it was a pretty clear-cut answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's an elected official. He can endorse anybody he wants. I don't understand why people would be so, thinking that he can't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah.
It's like, elected officials are very powerful in terms of what they can say and do. And basically our recourse is if we don't like what they're saying and doing, we can vote them out of office. But this was a puzzler.
Yeah.
Why would people think a sheriff couldn't endorse people?
And what I would say is that the best response he could ever give, saying this is just one individual. There are plenty of other sheriffs that could also endorse our current governor. It's an open door, free speech. We got to take advantage of it, either side.
Yeah, they can do what they want. It's
yeah.
It's what our political system is based in.
Well, the political system, and Beth, as we look at this, it's pretty strict as far as not being able to mess with what politicians say as far as case law and legislative law.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's nothing illegal about his actions. I think One thing that always strikes my students as strange, and I think it probably strikes the viewers and readers as strange, is that law enforcement positions are elected at all. I think that's the part that strikes people as strange, is why we elect sheriffs, why we elect prosecutors, district attorneys, judges, especially in partisan races. I think that's where things get odd for the public, given that they're not clearly what people would define as a political position. But then my answer to them is we also elect school board members, right? And education is not inherently political, though it clearly appears to be that way in this country at this time.
Yeah. And talking about electing sheriffs, we do have that amendment on the ballot that would basically force us to elect sheriffs and not give counties the chance to change their minds about how they pick a sheriff.
Yeah, I mean, it's the weirdest thing on the ballot. It really is. I don't know. It just seems like it's there to protect one person in the entire state of Kansas, and that is the Johnson County Sheriff. He is an election conspiracy theorist, and there's been some rumbling around Johnson County that, well, this guy is really, really partisan, and maybe we should change the sheriff election to a nonpartisan election, or perhaps appoint a sheriff, but that never went anywhere. And it really seems odd to be rewriting our entire Constitution to protect this one guy. It's just strange.
That is for sure strange.
It's not worth rewriting our Constitution for one
No, Carlos,
guy.
tell us what you really think.
Yeah, but that's it.
Yeah, that was the biggest puzzler on this ballot, and it's.
Well, Kansans are going to have to decide, no matter how puzzled they are, one way or the other on that one. Meanwhile, the city of Wichita says more and more landlords are opting out of a federal program that helps low-income people find a place to live. It's all because of the booming housing market. KXLY Eli Higgins takes a look at the problem.
Just want the place where I pay rent, that my children lay their heads, that I lay my head, to be suitable for us. We're not animals.
Heather J. is in the process of applying for a housing choice voucher, also known as Section 8. But she already lives in public housing and says it's a nightmare.
It's hard to find somewhere that will pass inspection, because they do have to do an inspection.
But she's lucky to even have an apartment at a place that accepts Section 8. Wichita Housing Choice Manager Matt Mercer says more and more landlords are opting out of the program, leaving people like Jay with literally nowhere to live.
Landlords right now can get a very good market rent for their units, so we can't always pay what they would like with the program.
Mercer says there are 400 to 500 people with approved vouchers who can't even find a place to apply before it expires.
We've had some complexes here in the Wichita area that have been purchased by out-of-state developers, and they've decided that they don't want to participate in the program at this time.
Mercer says while the red-hot housing market is a big part of the problem, he says there's another thing deterring landlords.
There are also ideas or misconceptions about someone that's receiving that type of assistance, which usually aren't the case.
Wednesday, Mercer held an informal meeting to address these concerns with landlords and explain how the program works, in hopes of getting more properties on the list and more people in homes. Something Jay says she greatly appreciates.
It's not everybody that destroys things. It's certain people, You get your good and your bad people everywhere, no matter what. I would like to see more places be open to that, to Section 8. Think if you would live there. Put yourself in our position.
And as she mentioned, Carlos, there are a lot of preconceived notions about Section 8 housing, about the people who get Section 8, perhaps playing into the problems that we're seeing now.
Well, Section 8 is a great humanitarian type of housing. It also requires private investors. So we're using private money in conjunction with government in order to create this partnership in providing housing for people who are vulnerable and need an opportunity. Many of these people tend to be refugees who have come to this country legally. We welcome them here to protect them. And we're just trying to give them a chance to go. In the meantime, private investors are also going to be paying in, and they're taking a risk. So it's a partnership between the government and private investors. Now, regarding companies buying out Section 8 type housing, I think that even though legally they may be able to go ahead and start shutting them out, I think that that's a legal right, but there's also a moral obligation. And these companies are going to be taking over these housing areas where they could just go ahead and lock people out, at least put a certain portion
Well,
to
really,
keep it
though,
open.
until these last few years, these landlords been making bank on this place, on these places. In fact, you know, I was in a Section 8 house one time, and while I was interviewing this guy about his natural gas bills, the water heater fell through the floor. And fortunately, you know, I'm from California, so earthquake country, I know how to turn off the gas before it blew the place up. But I talked to him about the house, and he was paying about $300. It was about 30% of his. It was about 30% of his income, and that guy was getting the landlord was getting like $1,200 for this place, and it was a dump. And it's like, you know, so for a long time they made bank on this, and now that housing prices have gone up so high and the cost of rents have gone up so high, it's like, okay, well, we can rent it for more if we, you know, take it out of the program. So it's just I don't know. I mean, times change, I guess.
Yeah. And Beth, I know that Wichita is certainly not the only city historically to deal with this, especially since Section 8 moved from, you know, project housing to the voucher system. Just because somebody has a voucher does not mean that there's necessarily a house or a landlord part of the program that will rent to them.
Yeah, and in fact, I would say that it's not at all specific to Kansas, right? This is a problem that exists throughout the country with Section 8 housing, or this sort of the voucher program that we're talking about. And so a number of places have adopted these non-discrimination laws to protect renters, but also to prevent landlords from using income as a source of a reason to deny somebody an application. So you can't use source of income like housing vouchers as a means to deny somebody. And that when those laws are in effect, it does do an amazing job for renters. And that, you know, there's one state I looked at where a third of housing vouchers were rejected in places that had non-discrimination laws, whereas it was 3/4 in places that did not have them. So that's one protection that can be put into place for renters and those who need Section 8 housing. But I think, you know, the point that is coming up from landlords is it's not just about the tight market, it's that Section 8 housing and the requirements of the program are yearly inspections, there's price limits, there's delay in payments. And so I think while it is a great private-public partnership, I think there's room for improvement that could certainly entice more landlords to get on board.
And certainly the case, and we're probably going to see it continue to get worse as the booming housing market continues.
Yeah, but what we want to do is we have an obligation to our communities to take care of the vulnerable. And yes, there's a lot of room for improvement in the Section 8A housing. So I would agree that we need to go ahead and continue to develop more regulations. And the bottom line is that this also has benefited the landlords. And we as taxpayers are paying in to help support these landlords to take care of our fellow citizens who are vulnerable. So I think that we need to go ahead and keep sharpening the blade and make sure that everyone gets a chance to live safely in a location.
And we're going to leave that one there because we've got a couple other stories to get to. Our next one comes from KU. Students there demanding an apology from the university after it found hundreds of Native American remains on campus illegally. KU's Maeve Ashbrook takes us to Lawrence.
It's signs like this one that remind KU Master's student Yamina Sfiat of what she calls an unsettling discovery every day.
You don't even need to be Indigenous to understand that that is a very unfortunate and disrespectful thing to happen.
The university announced it's found hundreds of Indigenous ancestral remains and cultural objects on campus, a violation of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
Unfortunately, it's not rare. This is going to continue to happen throughout all universities.
Some of those remains found here at the Lippincott Hall Annex, and this week students who come to class at this building every day are taking their demands to the Student Senate.
The resolution that we're hopefully going to pass tonight, the hope is that that will put a ton of pressure on the provost and the chancellor to actually do something about this.
Students with the Indigenous Studies Student Association wrote the resolution with support from the Senate. It calls for, among many requests, a full explanation from KU officials and for the school to find a new space for the Indigenous Studies program, currently housed at Lippincott Hall, which the university already says it will do.
With regards to it disrupting my education, it certainly has.
Sfiat says her culture doesn't allow her to be among the dead. The university says it's taking action to quickly but appropriately return those remains and objects to tribal nations in accordance with the law.
This isn't just a Native issue. This is an Indigenous issue. This is a global Indigenous issue, and I hope that with this resolution that KU can recognize that.
In Lawrence, Maeve Ashbrook, KU News on your side.
And that resolution did pass the Student Senate unanimously. Again, this story was earlier in the week, so we now know the results of that vote. And Beth, as we look at this issue, it is not unique to KU. It is not unique to Kansas. We're seeing this happening all over the country as we kind of start to come to terms with our past.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reckoning that many institutions will have to face or have faced. The reality is that human remains are an important part of research. But they are also an important component of many religious and cultural traditions, and the treatment of those remains is quite specifically defined within those cultural and religious traditions, and those two don't always match up, sort of the research need and sort of the cultural values. And so lots of universities, I think, will face this kind of question: what do we do in this kind of scenario to balance both? And that's what provosts and chancellors are paid for, right? To make that determination.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait and find out if they actually do respond to the students, answer the questions that they're being asked, because at this point we haven't heard.
Yeah. You know, and there's the law that regulates this. It only applies to artifacts that and remains that were found on federal or tribal land. So a lot of stuff has come off of private land. I think there's a whole box here of, like, it's just a Pandora's box, really, of what came from where, what can we have, what can't we have.
Yep.
You know, it's going to take some time to sort this all out.
All right.
The only question I have, and the question I ask to everyone in Kansas, throughout the United States, do you want to see your family members' bones being presented as some kind of article? No. Or do we want to have dignity for our family? That's it.
And that's a great way to look at it, to consider it from our own perspectives. Would we do the same thing? So moving on, finally today, the fight over whether to allow a wind farm to move in next door is splitting yet another Kansas community down the middle. Republic County is at the center of one of the latest battles.
And I do not care about these godforsaken machines that need to be relegated to the past as a failed experiment like they are. Thank you for your time.
Whether they hate it or love it.
I was wondering if we found a massive oil reserve under the eastern part of Republic County, would we be having this conversation?
The idea of bringing this to Republic County incites strong emotions and has filled the county commission meeting for months now. Lane Holmes says he's just worried about what the wind farm will mean for his crops.
My question has always been, because of other neighbors putting up the wind towers, who, and I suffer the loss, who pays me that loss?
He's worried about still being able to spray fungicides on his corn from airplanes. Not being able to do that, he says, means chances of money lost.
Upwards to $30,000, $40,000 loss per quarter. Now, that's probably extreme cases, but there are extreme cases that happen.
The owners of this field tell us that the wind farm would put towers there, and there, surrounding them and leaving them no way to bring in an aerial sprayer.
They won't touch this because there are communication towers within these that are very dangerous.
Meeting minutes show aerial sprayers have told commissioners about the difficulties in spraying around wind towers. But Lane and his neighbors feel the commission still hasn't answered their questions. So they've hired an attorney to go over the contract for them and for the county.
But it's got some traps. It's got some traps that could cost the county.
And Diane, you and I have seen these fights time and time again. Are communities able to get past these eventually once the decision of the wind farm is made? Because these fights get nasty sometimes.
Well, Sedgwick County did. They just banned them. But, but you know, my takeaway from this is it's good to be next era. They have just gotten $85 million from the Southwest Power Pool, which we will be paying part of. All the customers in the Southwest Power Pool will be paying for them to build a transmission line to take power from Kansas. It's from Wolf Creek into Missouri, to take power from Kansas to other states. You know, it's not just neighbor versus neighbor. It's neighbor versus neighbor versus the largest energy company in America. And who do you think is going to win?
Well, we've certainly seen them not win a couple of times, Sedgwick County, Reno County.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, these small counties, you know, a lot of this is their economic development plan because they got nothing else going on.
No.
You know, they don't have a whole lot of people wanting to come to these small counties to do things. And most of the farmers I've talked to really love windmills because they can put one on their property. They get paid for it, and they can still farm around it. So,
yep.
You know, there's different sides.
There is, and I have heard from some farmers in Republic County who are very pro windmill farm, but they don't want to speak in public about it because they are concerned about the vitriol that's been going around. Well, Diane, Carlos, Beth, thank you all so much for joining us this week. We'd also like to thank our news partners at KSN News, the Wichita Eagle, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to hear your ideas. Send them in. Meanwhile, stay safe and have a great week.